Tell me what y'all know about the book of Revelation, if anything at all.
It's the last chapter of the Bible.
It's what?
The last chapter of the Bible.
I can't still hear you.
It's
The
what
last chapter of the Bible.
this series is
It
focused
is the
on.
last chapter of the Bible, that is true.
Let me see. It's supposed to be like a storytelling book, like the past, present, and future.
That's the wrong movie, dude.
It's not necessarily a storytelling book, because that makes it, not that you meant to say it like that, but it does make it sound more like, oh, it's not real. It's a story. But,
Story, not like a letter?
so is Revelation about
Prophecy,
past?
that's what it is.
There you
Yeah,
Right.
go. Okay.
Hold it.
Anybody else? What do y'all think? What are some, like, I don't know, conspiracies or things that you've heard that are about? Have y'all heard, let me ask you this, have you ever heard of the concept of the rapture?
Yeah.
When Jesus comes back and then people who believe in him disappear, y'all heard of that?
Yeah, it was like,
Surely.
thousands in a balloon, or like a twinkle.
Yeah, okay. I'm sure y'all heard of the movie Left Behind. Maybe y'all have. Right, there's actually one that came out a couple years ago with Nicolas Cage. You know who he is? The actor? Dang, that's tough.
You guys don't know Nick Cage?
Point is, you probably at least wondered, okay, I want to know what exactly happens in the book of Revelation. Because if you've ever just tried to turn there and read it, right, just out of curiosity, you probably were like, I have no clue what I'm looking at and I never want to read it again. That's like way too out there for me, all right? Because it's not exactly, it's not 100% clear, right, what's being talked about, especially because you have to understand the rest of the Bible leading up to it to properly understand Revelation. There's a lot of scriptures that tie in to things from the Old Testament, right? So you kind of have to have that background knowledge to understand what's happening in Revelation. And in addition to that, there's like a lot of confusing like symbolic language that's used in Revelation. So again, it's like, if you don't really understand what's going on, you're going to be really confused. You're probably going to think this guy is like tripping on acid or something, describing this, you know, lion with these wings and all. It's like, I don't even, what is he seeing? Because that's not making, why is that in the Bible? Someone just documented their mushroom trip. Okay, that's not, but Revelation
Sounds like me.
is obviously has more meaning. It's not somebody high out of their mind. It is an actual vision that was given to John, the disciple. So tonight, we're going to talk about the beginning, right? We're going to talk about how the book of Revelation came to be, who wrote it, right? And kind of how we, as a group, as Christians, how we are going to interpret it and look at it, okay? So tonight will be session one, all right? The beginning. Isn't it funny? Because the series is called The End. So what do you think the last session is going to be called?
Actually,
Whoa.
I do get it, but it wasn't funny.
All right, so tonight we are only going to cover Revelation chapter 1. All right, so if you're like, you know, wanting to know what you should read, that's it. All right, well, I'm going to keep it super simple tonight, all right? Hard to not remember the verses, okay? Okay, so here's the basic backstory, all right? The author is John the disciple, right? This is the John whom Jesus loved, if you remember that, right? He served with Jesus as one of the inner circle, okay? He's one of the very close disciples of Jesus. So, and it was written in about the year 95 AD, okay? So if you're wanting to calculate and do the math here, Jesus was crucified in about 33 AD, right? And we know that the same year that Jesus, you know, was crucified and rose again, we know that he also left and went back to heaven. So this is, you know, about 40-ish years, maybe closer to like 50, 60-ish years later, John is finally writing down this vision he received from God. And he got this vision while he was being exiled on an island called Patmos. By the way, can y'all see this, or there's the glare? Let me have
It's
to.
good.
One eternity later.
Hey, YouTube, I'm cutting
Looks
this
like
out.
I'm not hitting up.
Cut it out. That's why I don't do stuff live with y'all. I could never do that. I would be nervous sweating all the time. Sit down.
Trash can.
Just set it on the ground.
Just hold on to it.
We don't have trash. We gotta get a brand new trash can. All right, we don't have one.
Not the
All right.
old one. It doesn't match.
Okay. Anyway, so John
I found a mini fridge.
is under persecution for his faith. Right? He's an old man now, obviously. All right, and so he has been sentenced to exile in a small island called Patmos. That is literally a picture of the island. I'm not making that up. That is what Patmos looks like today. Probably looked very similar a couple thousand years ago. But basically, he's put in quarantine. All right, social isolation. You go over here, stop preaching the gospel. That's what he was having to live through. And it was during this time of exile that he received a vision. Right, that God himself gave John this vision. It was not some trip. It was not some hallucination. It was a legitimate vision from God. And John saw things from the future that he could not describe in his own words. Okay? So I want to give you guys a couple definitions before we get started. First word is eschatology. All right? Maybe some of y'all, if you're from Ferris, you may eschatology. Eschatology, all right? And all that word means is this. It's a study of the last days in the Bible, okay? So the whole series is a study on eschatology, right? You ever heard of the word theology? It's what you believe about God. So eschatology is what you believe about the last days. And it's a branch of theology, right? It's a part of it, okay? So that's eschatology. And the second definition I want to give you guys is the millennial kingdom. So loosely defined, right, it's an era of peace as Christ reigns on earth. Okay, y'all got that. Very simple stuff. Both of these are very important words for you guys to know for the rest of the series because it's kind of based on these two definitions here. Okay. So, what is important for you guys to know is this, is that your view about the millennial kingdom determines how you read all of the book of Revelation. Okay? There are Christians who have differing views about when this millennial kingdom takes place. And if you don't know, millennial is a reference to a time period of 1,000. So millennial kingdom literally translates to 1,000-year kingdom. Okay? So there are three different viewpoints that Christians have about when the millennial kingdom happens. And depending on which of those views you have is going to determine how you interpret the events of Revelation. Is the book of Revelation, as it's given, is it in chronological order? Or is John just describing things and it's not in chronological order and then you kind of have to piece it together, right, in accordance with your view on the millennial kingdom? Okay? So the millennial kingdom, regardless of when you believe it happens, and we're going to get into those three views, okay, it is basically this. It is Christ in some form reigning on earth as the ultimate king, right? And the earth is under a period of peace. It's under a period of prosperity and health, right? Not like the prosperity preachers preach, everybody has their own private jumbo jet, but I mean like a legitimate period of peace where the world is actually as close as it can be to the Garden of Eden, right before mankind fell. Okay, that's what the millennial kingdom is. And that takes place, right before God remakes heaven and earth, right? So, in a nutshell, that's what the millennial kingdom is. What Christians disagree about is when this happens and how it happens. We don't disagree that it will happen, it's when it happens and how it happens. Y'all got that? It's the only disagreement. Okay, so the first view about the millennial kingdom is a view called post-millennialism. So people who believe in post-millennialism, we'll go through these things one at a time. I'm not expecting y'all to read all of that necessarily. Post-millennial is the belief that the millennial kingdom happens the millennial kingdom happens, after the return of Christ. Sorry, oh my gosh. Until 3 a.m. I've got it completely backwards. It is a belief that Christ returns after the millennial kingdom. Okay, so that's post-millennial, right? So the millennial kingdom happens after the return of Christ. Okay. I'm like having to remind myself, is this what I'm saying right now? Okay. So if you hold this view, you believe that the millennial kingdom is a figurative period of time, figurative period of peace that the church itself creates on earth. So people who are post-millennials, they don't believe that the millennial kingdom is a literal 1,000-year period of Christ reigning physically on earth. They believe that it is a figurative, or like a metaphorical amount of time, right, where the church, as we begin to increase, and we increase in numbers, and then we increase in our influence, that we're going to create a golden age on earth, right? That through the power of the Holy Spirit, right, more people are going to be saved. And so, in regards to the church, people who believe this, they think that the church is going to increase and grow stronger over time, right? And in regards to the world, they believe that the world's going to become better in turn to Christ, that the world's not going to get worse. It's going to get better, right? In regards to Satan, they believe that Satan is going to be bound or restricted from his activities, and he's going to lose influence over time. Okay? And there are two groups, one person and one group that you might be familiar with that actually holds to a post-millennial view, right? One is Jonathan Edwards. Okay? Now, you may think you don't know who Jonathan Edwards is, but if you've heard the song Amazing Grace, you do, because he wrote it. He was a former slave owner himself, and he felt convicted about his partaking in slavery. Or not slave owner, but he worked on a slave ship. And he felt convicted of that, turned away from it, became a Christian, and became like one of America's founding, if you will, evangelists, right? So he held to this view that the millennial kingdom is not a literal period of 1,000 years, but rather the church is going to bring in a period of peace as we make the world better, right? As we increase as the church. The Puritans also, there's a large portion of Puritans. Y'all remember those were like America's original settlers, right? The ones that actually helped to, create the colonies, right? The Puritans also believed that. In fact, that's actually what inspired them to leave England to come to America, was because they believed that God was leading them to create a nation that was going to produce, a rate of Christianity that was just going to change the whole world. And in some ways, they weren't entirely wrong. Because America has been an amazing nation in terms of sending out evangelists and missionaries. If you don't know this, America sends out more missionaries per, capita, means per 1,000 people, than any other country on earth. Okay? We do a lot of evangelizing here in America, and we send people out to do it. So they weren't entirely wrong that God did have a purpose for them, right?
But didn't they come at it a different way and kind of force people to believe in it?
No, not the Puritans.
Oh, was that the other ones?
The Puritans left England because one of the things is England, the government was forcing them to have a specific view of Christianity. And the government wasn't allowing them to practice their own faith. So they are actually the opposite. They were not interested in forcing people to believe things. Some denominations throughout history have done that, but that wasn't the Puritans. So in a nutshell, if you have the post-millennial view, you think that Christ's return is going to happen after the church brings in this period of peace. Okay? In a nutshell, that's what post-millennials believe. So I'm going to give you guys a little timeline, just help you kind of visualize it, because I'm a visual learner, so I got to see something, all right? So if we start, right, when Christ came to earth and go all the way until the end, right? We're going to start with Christ's ministry happens, right? And that little period, that little gap there is when Christ starts his ministry and when Christ leaves the earth, right? Everything was, not everything was perfect, but, Christ was on the earth. He was reigning, in a sense. He was reigning on earth for a short period of time in his ministry, right? But then Christ leaves. And so from there, the church is going to increase and grow. So there's a period of little darkness right after Christ leaves. But as the church matures, as we grow, and as we begin to have influence in governments and all these other things, the world's going to get better, right? And so this whole entire time period, from the time that Christ leaves until the time he returns again, we're going to bring in this millennial kingdom, right? That's the view. There's no specific time amount. It's not like, hey, in the year 3000 is when it's over. They don't put a time on, right? But then eventually, at some point, Christ is going to return. Then there's going to be the final judgment, and then after that is the eternal state, right? Where God creates a new heaven and a new earth, and it's permanent, right? It's eternal, right? Everything is made right again. Okay, so that's the post-millennial view. Any questions? Or hey, you said that and I was confused by that. Anything at all?
I have a question. What about when church talks about how the world is getting darker and darker?
Yes, that'll be one of the other views that we're going to talk about here in just say. But this is the post-millennial view, all right? That Christ's return happens after this millennial kingdom. Okay, so the second view we're going to talk about is called amillennialism, all right? Not amillennialism, amillennialism. I used to call it amillennialism. I thought that was how you pronounce it. Watch, I'm still wrong anyway. That'd be hilarious. Okay, so amillennialism, right, means, okay, think about this. You know, if somebody's an atheist, that means they believe there is no God. But if someone's an agnostic, they're like not sure.
They believe there's a God, but not there. They believe there's a higher power.
They think that maybe there's a God. I don't know. Okay, take that kind of a concept as far as the difference between an atheist and agnostic, and kind of that word agnostic is very similar to why it's called amillennialism. So if you believe in amillennialism, you also believe that the millennial kingdom is a figurative amount of time. It's not a literal 1,000 years. But you believe that it's a time of both peace and conflict that continues until Christ returns. So you don't necessarily believe that the world is going to absolutely 100% sure become better and near perfect, right? The amillennials believe this, is that Christians are going to experience both victory through Christ, and they're also going to experience persecution in the world. So there's going to be like this fluctuation between good and evil, between Christ's church, you know, gaining power in the world and helping people and having good influence, and then the world and Satan kind of trying to rip it back from us. There's going to be like this fluctuation, right? Where there's going to be both victory and suffering and persecution at the same time, right? And that from the time, you know, Christ left back in 33 AD up until Christ returns, the church is going to deal with this back and forth, right? And that's going to be kind of the millennial kingdom. It's like the millennial kingdom that is but isn't at the same time, right? It's like the already but not yet. It's like Christ does have a victory, but he doesn't have it quite yet because he's not done. It's that back and forth, okay? And so they believe also that Christ's return is going to happen after the millennial kingdom. But the difference between them and post-millennial is they don't believe the world is going to go from bad to awesome. They believe there's that constant state of conflict until Christ returns. Does that make sense? Hopefully it's a little bit different, a little bit more nuanced. So in regards to the church, they believe that the church is going to increase while still suffering persecution. The church will, you know, make some improvements and have a better influence, but we're also going to have some setbacks. In regards to the world, they believe that throughout world history, you're going to see the world will experience both good and evil eras. There's going to be times where Christians have good influence and the world's better. There's going to be times where Christians lose influence and the world suffers for it, right? And in regards to Satan, during this time period, they believe that Satan is going to be restricted to a certain extent, but not completely. All right, but post-millennials believe Satan is basically going to be handicapped. He has basically no power, and the church is just going to take over, right? And nothing can stop it in human terms, right? But Amillennial is like, no, he'll be like, you know, he's not going to have complete control, but, you know, he's still gonna throw some fists at us, right? Try to keep us from, you know, having our influence. So, two people who believe this, two very famous people, which y'all probably heard of both of them in your history class. One of them is John Calvin. If you don't know him, he's the founder of Calvinism, which is the belief that God predestines every part of your life, right? That you really don't truly have free will, that God chooses who's going to be saved and not, okay? So whether or not you think you agree with that idea, he had a big influence in the Christian world as far as a lot of his teaching. And then Martin Luther, right? Not Martin Luther King, all right? Martin Luther, the guy who did the 95 Theses, right? And broke away from the Catholic Church to start Protestantism, that guy. They both were amillennials, right? They had that idea that, listen, the church is we're going to have our moments of victory, but we're still going to suffer setback, and we're not 100% sure, right, when this battle is going to be over until Christ returns, right? And so here's kind of the timeline for amillennialism, similar to post-millennial, just with a few changes. All right, so Christ's ministry, Christ is on earth, everything's going well, but then Christ leaves, right? Darkness comes back, right? Now the world has lost its best defender, okay, if you like Marvel movies. But then from the time that Christ leaves until he returns, there's that fluctuation between good and evil on earth, between Christians having influence and Christians losing it. But when Christ finally does return, right, then final judgment's going to happen, and then we go into the eternal state. So that's the difference, is the idea of this victory and suffering simultaneously, or just the world is really bad, but it's going to get really good. That's the difference between post-millennials and amillennials. Any questions so far? Because we got one more view, all right? And this is probably the one that y'all are most familiar with, all right? Being in America, all right? The last view is pre-millennialism. So, pre-millennials believe that the millennial kingdom happens after the return of Christ, right? Or post-millennials believe the millennial kingdom happens before the return of Christ. So Christ returns after the millennium. Pre-millennials believe Christ returns before the millennium. That's why it's pre, all right, before. No confusion, right? Okay, so if you believe in pre-millennialism, you think that millennial kingdom is a literal 1,000-year period of time that Christ is physically reigning on earth. Like, you can see him, you can talk to him, and you can like literally he's right there, all right, on earth, reigning physically as he was when he was here on earth when he died on the cross. He'll be reigning here as king for a literal 1,000-year period of time. Okay? And you believe that Christ is going to return before this happens, right? Because Christ, upon his return, is going to create the millennial kingdom. He's going to bring humanity into this time, right? The church isn't going to do it. It's not just going to happen on its own, but he's going to create it, right? Because we don't have the power. That's the belief. So in regards to the church, before the millennial kingdom happens, you believe that the church is going to experience increased persecution, and eventually is going to have what's called the great falling away, where many, many people who claim Christ are going to fall away before the return of Christ, right? And so the church is going to actually have an increase in their persecution, not less. Things are going to get harder, not easier. In regards to the world, they believe that the world is actually going to become worse and more hostile to God as time goes on. And again, until the return of Christ happens, the world is just going to get worse, right? Become more sinful, turn away from God more, become more involved in just terrible, things. In regards to Satan, if you believe in premillennialism, you think that basically Satan has free reign. He is the temporary king of this earth, and he can do whatever he wants within God's allowance, right? He has free reign to have his temporary control of the earth, right? Until Christ returns and makes himself king, right? Satan can do whatever he wants. But when that Christ sets up his kingdom, Satan is completely locked away and prevented from having any interference, right? So, as far as who believe this, you'll probably know one of these guys, Billy Graham. You ever heard of Billy Graham before? America's preacher?
Yeah.
Right, he's around the 50s. Now, you weren't around in the 50s, but you probably have heard of him in history class. You probably maybe seen a little audio clip or something. Right, so Billy Graham...
Instagram a lot. His older stuff, like back when he preached in the 60s.
Yeah.
I see a lot of his older stuff.
Yeah, so he's a really, if you ever want to check out Billy Graham, please check it out. He's a really passionate, energetic preacher, right? Now, he's dead now. But he was a really passionate, energetic preacher, all right? So he believed in the premillennial view. And this guy, John Darby, you're like, okay, we're at the point, I don't even know, Tyler, who is that? He was the guy that kind of helped to formulate or kind of put on paper what it exactly was what the premillennial view of the end times was. So it was kind of like, he didn't necessarily invent it, so to speak, but he kind of helped preach it and put it down on paper and kind of explain it to people. Okay? So, now the question y'all might probably have is, okay, Tyler, what do you think? What is your opinion? What do we as a church believe? What's our stance? Okay, before I do that, let me give the premillennial timeline. Then I will give our stance. Okay, so the premillennial timeline looks like this. You have Christ's ministry, then Christ leaves, all right? And during the moment from Christ leaves until he returns, the world gets worse, right? Get the light blue to the dark blue, it gets worse, all right? I'm using colors to help y'all visualize sin. But right before Christ returns is this period called the tribulation period. A 7-year period, right, of where the world experiences the most intense suffering and persecution that it's ever seen in all of history. And then right after that last 7 years is done, Christ returns and sets up a millennial kingdom. Completely eradicates, right, all Satan and his minions and all that stuff, and creates a millennial kingdom for 1,000 years on earth. And then once that is complete, then the final judgment happens, right? And then God creates a new heaven and a new earth and goes on into the eternal state. So this is one that has the biggest difference between the other two. Okay, now the tribulation period is probably what you guys are familiar with hearing about, because the tribulation period has its own little timeline, right? Because the tribulation period is what includes the belief about the rapture, right? We've heard of the rapture of the church. So the tribulation period lasts 7 years, according to the premillennial view. And there's difference of opinion about when the rapture happens. So you're thinking, but Tyler, isn't the Christ return and the rapture the same thing? It's actually not. Because in the rapture, as it is taught, Christ does not physically return to earth to reign on it. All that happens is the church, the believers, are snatched away. You just like get yeeted out of existence, all right? You're just gone. You're brought up to heaven, and then the world is now left without any Christians in it at that exact moment, right? Okay, so if you believe in the premillennial view, you believe in a tribulation period that happens right at the end, before Christ returns, but you might disagree about when the rapture happens. Okay? A lot of Christians believe in what's called a pre-tribulation rapture, where you have the rapture of the church that then initiates the tribulation period, right? Then you have some Christians say, no. Christians are actually going to live through the first 3.5 years of it, and then Christ is going to rapture them out right in the middle. And then God's going to judge the earth and just judge the non-Christians. But then you have some Christians say, no, actually, there's not really going to be a rapture, so to speak, because Christians are going to live through the whole tribulation period, and we're not going to be brought out of this world until Christ returns. So this post-trib rapture is not really a belief in a rapture. It's a belief that there's just one return of Christ, right? There's not like a rapture and then a Christ return. It's just Christians will go through the entire 7 years of tribulation just like everybody else.
Well, that would make sense if Jesus takes all the Christians out, how are there going to be Christians in the tribulation?
And we'll get to that. Very good question, though. Okay, so yeah, if you did believe in this, then how would the rest of it work or make sense? Good question. But one thing I want to clarify, though, is that none of these views are essential to be saved or to be a fruitful, productive Christian. Like, if you believe in a post-millennial view, right, where the return of Christ happens after the millennial kingdom, okay, you're not going to lose your salvation, right? If you believe in a pre-millennial view, right, you're not a lesser Christian. These views do not determine whether or not you're saved. They don't determine whether or not you're going to heaven, okay? These are views that Christians are allowed to disagree about, okay? Because no Christian, no matter how much we study the Bible, we're not going to be 100% confident about what happens until it happens, right? You can study the Bible your entire life about Revelation, but it's the only portion of the Bible that hasn't happened yet. Y'all know that? The rest of the Bible has already occurred. It's a history book. It's writing down everything that God has revealed to humans throughout history, but the book of Revelation is a prophecy of the future that hasn't occurred yet. So no Christian is 100% sure, and none of these views are going to disqualify you as a Christian from being saved, right? This is not a core or essential thing that you have to get right, or then, God's going to kick me out of heaven if I didn't have the exact right timeline in my head of what I thought was going to happen. That's not what this is. So I want to clarify that up front. Okay, Christians are allowed to disagree, and they do, right? We've had famous Christians from all throughout history who've disagreed over this issue of how does the book of Revelation work, okay? But I do want to say this, that as a church, what do we believe here at Patrick Baptist Church, all right? We believe, out of the three millennial views, we believe in pre-millennialism. We believe that the return of Christ will happen and then the millennial kingdom will start. Okay, we believe in a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth that will happen in the future. And so with that, then the question is, okay, then what do we believe about the rapture? How do we think the rapture will occur? we believe in a pre-tribulation rapture. So we believe that the Christ will return for his church, okay, right at the beginning of this 7-year tribulation period. And then throughout that 7 years, we believe that's what the Bible, the book of Revelation is describing when it's talking about these judgments. Then after that 7 years of judgment is completed, then Christ will return physically to establish his millennial kingdom. Now we are going to get more into why we believe that, okay, and exactly what the ins and outs of that are as we go through this series, okay? But I want you guys to know this. You are absolutely, I'm not going to go there. You guys are absolutely allowed to ask questions and to even go, I don't know if I believe that, okay? Because, again, this is a human's attempt at trying to understand a prophecy that hasn't happened yet. Okay, so I'm going to try to give you guys as much clarity as I can and why I believe that this view makes the most sense and why I believe that's how we should interpret the book of Revelation. But don't think that if you have questions that you're not allowed to ask them. That's why we're doing this series, because I want you guys to think about these things for yourself. I want you guys to go study the Bible and look at the book of Revelation and go, okay, how do these three views, how do they all interpret this book? Which one do I, really makes the most sense as far as how this book works? I want you guys to think about this, okay? I don't want y'all to think that you're not allowed to question anything that I say. Because again, so now, when I quote the Bible, right, we don't want to question, like, the authority of God's Word, but we can question, okay, whether or not man truly understands this particular prophecy. We can question that, right? We know we're not perfect at understanding the future. Only God is. But one thing, one kind of rule that we will use to interpret the book of Revelation is this, and this was the slide I had next, is that the book of Revelation, the vision that God gave John, was a vision of John's immediate future, like what was going to happen in his lifetime, and it was also of a far future. So from John's perspective, his vision applied to his present and our future. So when you read, and as we go through it, and again, I'll make sure to point these things out to you guys, don't feel like you got to figure it out for yourself. You're going to see how there are things that John is seeing that apply both to what was happening in his lifetime that also apply to us today. So God gave John almost like a dual vision, if that makes sense. Like, John, hey, here's what's going to happen in your immediate future, right? In the immediate future of the church in your lifetime, but this is also going to be a warning for the church to come after you, right? So it applies both to John's present and our future, right? So that's how we're going to kind of understand it, is it's not just talking about the past and it's not just talking about the future. It's kind of talking about both, right? There's a parallel going on in the book of Revelation, okay? I want to give you guys this one quick passage from the book of Revelation. Let me check my time, all right? 8:06. So yeah, I am going to give you one passage, okay? So if you don't have your Bible, you read up there. By the way, please bring your Bibles. If you need one, I'll get you one next time, all right? Revelation chapter 1, verse 3 says, "Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written in it, for the time is near." Okay? That's John, the very beginning, the opening of the book of Revelation, saying, listen, God bless you by reading this and studying this because the time is near. Okay? There's a little bit of urgency to what he's saying. So, why is it so important that we study the book of Revelation, right? What is it that John needs to tell us, to warn us about, that it is so important that, listen, we have a special blessing for even studying this particular book of the Bible? That is going to be what we start getting into next Wednesday. Sorry to leave you on a cliffhanger, but y'all know we couldn't do the whole thing in one night, all right? So, if you guys have any questions at all, like, I'm being serious, anything that you're still confused about or you want clarity about, write those questions down, whether it's on your phone, whether it's on a piece of paper, all right? And here's the great thing. If y'all have our numbers, y'all can text us or call us and say, hey, I really want to study this more. Yeah, our numbers are on the board, all right, if y'all ever need them. And then and at the very end of this series, we're going to do a question and answer where we're going to go through a lot of y'all's questions and have open discussion about it, which I think is always a lot of fun. All right, where we actually get to talk as a class about it, not just me teaching all the time. And another thing that I will say is this, all right? One more thing, and I'm for real done.
Okay.
Okay. Is John also uses a lot of metaphors when he describes things, okay? So he's seeing a vision of the future, and you're going to see, okay, when he starts describing these crazy-looking animals, you're going to understand very quickly he's not describing an animal that literally looks like that. He's describing some kind of future technology that he can't quite describe, okay? And so when we see some of these metaphors in the book of Revelation, we have to understand that he's not necessarily describing something literal. He's not talking literally. He's trying his best to describe what he is seeing. So as we read through the Revelation, we're going to keep in mind, it both applies to John's present and our future. And we're also going to remember, right, that not every word in Revelation is meant to be literal or taken that way. Okay? So those are 2 rules we're going to apply as we go through the book of Revelation.
Imagine like dreaming and like seeing an airplane and not knowing what it is, and then
trying to describe to everybody, the big bird with no flappy wings, and it had people in it. Yeah, bro. Whatever. You got too close to that burning bush that Moses got to. I don't know what. Okay, yeah. Trust me. That's the struggle that John had, and we're gonna see. There's a lot of interesting things we're gonna talk about. Okay, but I hope you guys got a little bit of interest. Hopefully, they get you guys. You're like, oh man, I want to know what's next. I want to know the rest of it. Some of you are probably like, oh, that sucks. I'm like, I don't like that. It's too detailed for me. Regardless, I hope to see you guys next Wednesday as we continue. All right. So, that being said, bow your heads, close your eyes. Let me say a word of prayer first, real quick. Dear God, thank you so much for today, God. I want to thank you for, again, allowing us to come here to study your word free from persecution at this moment, God. And so as we go through the book of Revelation, God, I know there's so many details. God, there's so many, timelines and ideas, and there's so much we could get lost in, God. But I pray that you could help us to keep our focus primarily on you. God, the book of Revelation is ultimately about your victory on earth. Regardless of the specifics of how that happens, God, we know that your victory is guaranteed, no matter what, God. And whether it's the post-millennial or pre-millennial or amillennial view that's correct, God, we know that you have the final victory. And God, I pray that as we read through the book of Revelation, God, that we could be encouraged, and we could have the hope in your victory over this world, God, that we are not going to see defeat for the rest of our lives, God, that we are not without hope in this world, God. We have the only hope that is worth having in this world, God. So help us to keep that in mind. It's ultimately about you and your victory, God. It's not about us and our theories. It's about you, God. And help us remember that. And help everyone have a safe night tonight. In Jesus' name, amen.